Well, we have two exceptional and well-disciplined speakers who are going to address you on this afternoon's panel. So I'll start out with a brief rambling introduction to the topic and the speakers. You're in for a treat. This not just because we have these two exceptional speakers, but because the issue itself is so salient right now. Right now, today, in this whole country, especially perhaps this whole country. This question of what we believe, who we follow, what we do, what we read, what channel, what narrow perspective we follow, which is easier to do these days than it used to be. How many folks were in yesterday's panel on the media, where we had some newspaper reporters? So you might think of this as really related to that. And for those who weren't there, the relation is that we had four really exceptional old school newspaper, media, radio reporters. And the afternoon panel was really a lamentation. In a biblical sense.
Jeremiah.
It was Jeremiah. Well, there was some Jeremiah, but there was a lot of lamentation. There was general lamentation with the periodic Jeremiah and a little jihad. No fatwas were issued, but to my knowledge, but that I noticed. I'll put it that way. But the idea that these guys are print journalists and NPR radio, and the idea that they're in their prime. They've been doing it for years, and their concern was that people don't read newspapers anymore. And they took a poll of the audience, and I'll ask, for those of you in the audience, raise your hand if you read a daily paper. You open up a paper, a thing that's made of paper. All right. Now, see, that's harder to do for students in class. It's easier to just check your iPad than it is to open up the New York Times, because a professor's going to notice that. Now, how many of you under 30, and if you are on that cusp as I am, between 30 and beyond, hold your thought. How many of you truly under 30 read the newspaper on a daily basis? Print newspaper, right, and open up the print thing. All right, so 0. I'm willing to believe we have some folks under 30 here. How many of those under 30 read a traditional newspaper, New York Times, Washington Post, online, an online version? So at least there's some. Okay, so now there you go. Now you would still be accused, as I'm accused by my students. By the way, see, I told you to be rambling. I'm Eric Dannenmeyer. I am a professor of law, and I direct the Environment and Natural Resources program at Indiana University's McKinney School of Law, one of two law schools in Indiana. And I was here at Tulane. I ran the Environmental Law Institute here in the early aughts, from aught 1 to just before and then just after Katrina, aught 6. And then I went off to other things, not for the lack of the love of this place. So that's, I'll skip my background, but I still read the newspaper, and I still sort of pore through different sections, and I'm often surprised at what I see. In fact, on my give you some advice, iPad or iPhone or probably any other device, there are apps. I read Associated Press. It's got a great app. Usually it comes there first. Those guys have got people. Associated Press, United Press International. I read the Huffington Post, which is a bit left-leaning. The Washington Post, which has a paywall. Everything else is free so far. Washington Post has a paywall. Chronicle of Higher Education, paywall, and that's kind of dull. It's not really going to help us. And then for just variety, Fox News. And when I mention the New York Times to my students, they'll think, well, that's a liberal rag, some of them. So even though we might read really a newspaper or a source of news that most of us would view as very credible and very old school, there are still folks, because of the current narrative and dialogue, there are still folks who are going to think, well, that's a left-leaning or a right-leaning thing. And I do a survey now in my classes. I teach constitutional law as well as environmental type classes, and I do a survey in my big first-year classes that includes some questions about where they're coming from, what their majors were, what they want to learn, and then I ask them their news source. And I find that in a school of 100, or a class of 100 students in the Midwest, law students, so this is a privileged group, well-educated to begin with, and 10-20% get their source from talk radio or Fox. An awful lot, though, get news sources from other places, and an increasing number get it from just their friends, right? Because of Twitter, because they're following Facebook, because basically they're reading what's been forwarded to them. So it relates to yesterday's subject in the sense that technology is wonderful, there's a lot more data out there, but we are slowly, perhaps, some of us, closing ourselves in and gathering our data from sources that agree with us. Turns out there's a lot of research, and I think we're going to hear some about that today, that suggests that that's perhaps natural, that we seek people with whom we agree, that we respond to things that we agree with, that what we might see as an echo chamber is actually a sort of a natural instinct or something that we tend to do, whether it's natural or not. So this, as I said, you're really in for a treat today, because as soon as I shut up, which won't happen for another minute or so, you get to hear from these really exceptional scholars who are thinking about this issue, this question of sort of what's the news feeds that we get and how we respond and how it makes us respond to policy issues, specifically climate change. So that the big issue is that we're gathering and we're sending data to each other and listening to people we believe or we find credible, and we're ignoring things we don't find credible, and that's across the political spectrum. But what it's leading to is a huge percentage of our fellow citizens in this country simply not accepting some things that, science is science, I'll just say it. When I teach environmental law, I didn't have to do this. When I was teaching in DC back in the 90s, before 1998, if anyone knows that significant date, the American Petroleum Institute policy decision to go and try to bring some neutral scientists who would then go out and spread a party line about climate. Before 98, the Kyoto Protocol, before the whole climate scare, when I was teaching in the mid-90s at American University, and I got to climate change, I could just say to my class, climate change, look, there may be a couple guys living in huts somewhere who deny it, but for the rest of us, let's talk about the policy piece. Then those two guys got elected president and vice president, and the discourse shifted. Candidate Bush, who didn't deny climate and said he was going to do something about it, became President Bush, who literally forbade his administration from talking about it. As I was leaving the Clinton administration, I was working adjunct teaching at American. I was with USAID. The first few months of the Bush administration, we couldn't talk about climate anymore. Literally couldn't do it. I was working international development overseas in countries where climate was a huge issue. Climate change was driving major national concerns, and we couldn't say that, and it was just weird. Of course, I said it anyway, but then I quickly moved into academia. And so what these guys are going to be talking about is this phenomenon, this I don't know what to call it other than a phenomenon, this tragedy perhaps that that a lot of us aren't open to other ideas, and we don't engage in debates the way we used to, and that we're in this feedback loop, and that for a large percentage of our population, that's leading to people simply saying, climate doesn't exist, it's a myth. It's a hoax, according to at least one Republican senator from Oklahoma. Probably both. When I first went to Indiana 7 years ago, I only talked to one of them about it, hoax. When I went to Indiana 7 years ago, the entire congressional delegation from that state that year, everyone running a contested election that year, meaning all the House of Representatives and one of two senators, publicly denied climate change. Now, perhaps as a way of getting elected, don't know. Perhaps they're listening to the same feedback loop. So this is a phenomenon, it's a challenge, and it's specifically a challenge when we talk about climate. And as I said, we're privileged to have two exceptional speakers here who are more disciplined than I, and will talk to you about this issue. I'll introduce them both, and then I'll sit down and let them go in that order. We have Jamie Madrigano, and Jamie is a specialist in epidemiology. She works with RAND Corporation, a company that does some really amazing, it's a huge think tank that does some really amazing data work, and they're all over the place. When I was at USAID, we relied a lot on their work overseas and their ability to really crunch numbers and be very empirical. She, she's associate policy researcher at RAND, and she's going to talk to us first about framing the consequences of mitigation. And then we're going to hear from Rob Verchik, who works across the street, but also here. Rob is the Gautier Saint-Martin Chair in Environmental Law at Loyola. I assume that's how they pronounce it over at Loyola. But he's also a senior fellow at the center here at Tulane on disaster resistance. He's also the president of the Center for Progressive Reform, and spent a couple years in Washington himself as the deputy associate administrator for policy in EPA. So these are folks with experience, with credentials, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say about this challenge, which I framed in a very broad sense, but they're going to focus on the climate aspect and what this phenomenon means for us in a time when we ought to be engaging the issue. So without further ado, Jamie.
Thank you very much for that really gracious introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today with my distinguished co-panelist and moderator and to speak with all of you at this summit. It's my first time here, but it seems really wonderful so far. I am an environmental epidemiologist, which basically means I like to think about population health. And what are some causes to adverse health impacts, as well as how we can sort of quantify public health burden and links between exposure and disease. And most of my work has focused on environmental exposures, specifically air pollution and extreme weather. And that's really what the bulk of my research work has been around, although it's not really what I'm going to talk about today. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of an outgrowth of some of that work. Everything I'm going to present today, although I am, as mentioned, a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation right now, this work was actually done while I was a fellow at Columbia University. And while I was there, I had a really nice opportunity to interact with scientists from a broad array of fields and had a chance to ask some questions about things that my own work sort of led me to think about and talk to different decision scientists and psychologists and see if there were ways that we could look at some of these questions. So I'll just get started. So as we know, climate change poses a major motivation problem for the general public in the U.S. And some thoughts around why that may be are because the effects of climate change seem very uncertain, at times have been hard to quantify, and for many people they don't feel like climate change is personally affecting them. I think this has actually changed a lot over the last few years, but still, there are many people who feel that the most of the impacts of climate change are happening far away and into the future. So it's not really happening here at home. But we also know that a key climate mitigation effort is the reduction of fossil fuel use. And this has the benefit that goes along with it of also, if we were to cut down on fossil fuel combustion, we'd also be cutting down on the emissions of hazardous air pollutants that are impacting people every day right now. And that's really how I came to this issue, because a lot of the work I've done is looking at pollutants like particulate matter and how that impacts people's health. So how does that increase asthma exacerbations and hospitalizations, and who are the people that are particularly susceptible to these things? And as an academic scientist, we like to read a lot of other scientists' work, and we like to talk to other scientists. And I found that many of us were saying a lot of the same things, and reading and writing about how could we quantify these co-benefits. How could we make the case that, even if climate change impacts are uncertain, with certain mitigation policies, we'd still see a real improvement to human health right now, and we'd actually see economic benefits from that, from reductions in healthcare costs. And so for about over a decade, scientists have been trying to better quantify these climate and health co-benefits. And it seems like a real win-win in the scientific literature. But I constantly felt, as just discussed in the introduction, there's a real divergence when you read the popular press or when you read, you try to understand what the general public is thinking about that. And I really wondered, was the general public getting this message about health co-benefits of climate mitigation? And if they are, is this resonating, with people, and is it a better messaging tool? So just to speak a little bit more specifically about this, I wanted to mention that in particular, ambient air pollution, I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with the health impacts of it, but I did want to mention that just recently a new estimate came out about quantifying the number of premature deaths worldwide that ambient air pollution is thought to be responsible for, and that number is quite large, 5.5 million deaths. And it's true that a lot of this number is based off of the severe air pollution burden that we see in places like India and China. But it's still a significant impact, and there are still many counties within the U.S. that don't meet national ambient air quality standards. So worldwide and at home, particulate matter air pollution and other air pollutants like ozone are still having large health impacts. We also know from the health behavior literature that personal risk perception is a strong motivator for behavior change. And so as I continued to think about this, I really thought that while a couple of people had started to look at framing climate change as a health issue and talking about the health implications of future climate change and seeing if that messaging strategy worked, I thought that really talking about these present day health co-benefits of climate mitigation might be another strategy or a messaging framework that might be an interesting thing to look at. So in thinking about that more, I started talking, as I mentioned, to some psychologists and decision scientists, and we started formulating some research questions. And just two simple ones here we thought would be interesting to try to look at in a little more detail was, does the general public consider that health or climate is a more compelling reason to reduce fossil fuel use? And then if we saw something there, is there a way to frame climate mitigation and climate mitigation policies in a way that sort of emphasizes present-day public health impacts to elicit a response? So as we tried to think about looking at this more, we ended up conducting a series of studies, and I'll present a few results from some of those today. So these were all internet-based surveys. We recruited participants through something called Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and we first conducted a web-based survey where we asked a number of questions about beliefs and attitudes around climate change and environmental health risk. And then we conducted a series of framing experiments. So this is just one question from the initial web-based survey. And we asked participants, what is a more compelling reason to decrease the burning of fossil fuels? And simply gave them three response choices, climate change, health, or neither. And we had about 400 people who took this survey. And initially, the results, honestly, were pretty underwhelming. We saw that about 10% of the population said neither. Okay, so we're not probably going to reach them with any strategy. But then the population was pretty much split down the middle. So this idea about emphasizing health maybe really wasn't panning out. But as we continue to look at the data and all of the questions that we had, we noticed that again and again, the by far strongest predictor, of course not surprising, I'm sure it won't be surprising to anyone in this room, but the strongest predictor of any answer to any question was how participants self-identified in terms of their political orientation. So we asked a number of demographic questions about gender and age and income, and one of them was also about how do you identify, with a 5-point range being from very liberal, liberal, moderate, conservative, very conservative. And so that really was a big driver of a number of questions. And so we thought, well, let's maybe look at this question and stratify the data by this political orientation and see what we get. So, so that's what we did. So just to orient you, I'll have the y-axis has the proportion of the sample that responded in a certain way according to the colors, and then across the x-axis, on the left-hand most side are the most liberal people who identified as very liberal, and then all the way to the right-hand side where people identified as more conservative. So in terms of people that responded that climate was the most compelling reason, you can definitely see that for the very liberal and liberal people, a large proportion of those people identified climate as a more compelling reason. And then, as I mentioned, we did have a neither sample, which, you know, again, we're just not going to reach them, but it also was or at least we're not going to reach them with these two messaging strategies. There's others, you know, that may, but in terms of what we were looking at. So, but that was only 10%. But, you know, laughing aside, I think what we found most interesting was actually this group here, where we had people who identified as moderate and conservative, where we see a pretty substantial increase in the people that chose health as a compelling reason to decrease the burning of fossil fuels. Now, again, just a simple internet survey, a simple question, but we thought that was kind of interesting and gave us a little motivation to proceed with a couple of other experiments and framing experiments. So now I'll show those. So just to provide some context, framing is a way to set an issue in an appropriate context to get some desired effect. So you might think about, well, if you were doing your grocery shopping and you were looking at steaks, would you buy a steak that was labeled as 90% fat-free, or would you buy something that was labeled as 10% fat? So we might, you know, so you can see how this, and this has been used in plenty of decision science studies, and some in particular related to climate change. There was one study that looked at how to frame paying for an offset or a tax in terms of when you buy a plane ticket, and you know, it was either labeled as a carbon tax or a carbon offset. And in this study, they did also see that, again, political orientation of the respondents really drove what option they preferred in terms of that language. So back to our study. So the first framing experiment we performed was where we, and the way this worked is just participants logged on and they're randomly assigned to one of two frames. Okay, so half of the participants randomly saw this paragraph, which said that the burning of fossil fuels emits air pollutants that are harmful to human health, and continued fossil fuel burning will result in a large number of deaths. And then the other half saw this paragraph, which is the burning of fossil fuels emits air pollutants that cause climate change, and continued fossil fuel burning will result in dire environmental consequences. Now, again, also very just simple paragraphs, and the goal is to try to keep them very similar so that the two frames are as similar to each other as possible, so that you can sort of isolate where the difference in response may come from, is, you know, just what you're interested in, that health or environmental wording. So the results of this also were kind of underwhelming. We really didn't see an effect of the frame. And we were, you know, disappointed because based on that earlier question about people looking for compelling reasons, we thought we might see something related to political orientation. But we didn't. So we thought about it a little bit, and we thought to ourselves, well, maybe it's something in the way we designed this frame. We got some feedback from some other colleagues. And then we continued to read, and we looked at this word fossil fuel. We thought, maybe this is somewhat politically charged. Maybe this is causing some differences that, you know, we're not sure how they're playing out. So let's go on to another experiment, another quick, simple experiment, just to see if there's something to do with that fossil fuel word that is causing some kind of reaction that we didn't foresee. So now we performed an experiment where we showed half the sample this paragraph, which talks about the burning of fossil fuels emits air pollution that is harmful to human health and will result in many premature deaths. So both focusing on health, but we eliminated in the second frame any talk about fossil fuels. We just said air pollution is harmful to human health and will result in many premature deaths. And so then we looked at the results from this. Now, these are the people that didn't see any fossil fuel in the paragraph. And we see, although it's true there's a little bit of dip, but we pretty much see just some generally strong agreement. Oh, and I should say we asked, you know, then subsequent to that, how strongly do you agree with this statement on a 5-point scale from disagree to from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So in general, across the political spectrum, we don't see much change. When we looked at the people that were exposed to the paragraph that talked about fossil fuel, we see a pretty big difference across the spectrum. So, you know, in those that self-identified as very liberal, there's strong agreement. But we can see this decline here when we move down the political spectrum.
I'm sorry, but the vertical ones, what does that mean?
That's just statistically, there's like some error around the estimates of, because we're taking a sample of, sorry, I should have, so it's just to give us some idea, to give you a sense, there was a,
Like a deviation?
yeah, there's like a smaller group of in the sample as a whole, the people that identified as very conservative, there was a smaller group of those. So there's a little more error around that, that point estimate. Okay.
Good question.
Yeah, good question. So we thought, okay, this is kind of interesting. Maybe that fossil fuel term is triggering some sort of emotional response. And we did, because we had other information about these people, like gender and age. We also used some regression models to try to control for all of those other things. And when we did that, we saw that there was what we call an interaction between this, how people identified in terms of orientation and what frame they saw. So the political orientation really changed the effect of the frame. So, okay, so now we thought, all right, well, this is something, so let's return to our original idea and see if there's a way we can modify that frame and test our original hypothesis without maybe having this messiness of talking about fossil fuels. So we did that, and this is the modification. Again, it led to a very sort of simplified 2 paragraphs, but this is the final framing experiment. And so half the sample saw a statement that said air pollution contains gases and particulates that are harmful to human health and will lead to many premature deaths. And then the other half of the sample saw a statement that said air pollution contains gases and particulates that contribute to climate change and will lead to negative environmental consequences. And then again, we asked about agreement with this statement afterwards, and then we asked some subsequent questions as well. So in terms of agreement with that statement, this is what we found. So these are in terms of people who saw the climate frame. We see very strong agreement, again, in those that identify as very liberal, and that agreement does decline a bit or somewhat as we move down the political spectrum toward very conservative. And we had about 800 people who responded to this framing experiment. Now, this is the people who saw the health frame. And so here we see, again, that crossover effect where it looks like there is a little bit more agreement in terms of those on the conservative side of the spectrum, when they see the health frame, they're more willing to agree with that statement.
Sorry, this is all through the Amazon?
This is all through
Is
Amazon.
that random?
Well, so it is people who volunteer to take online surveys, and they're paid
Jamie,
a
could
small
you
amount of
just-
money.
On that question, on the recruitment question, I'm wondering about a recruitment bias. What was your recruitment framing?
Well, it was.
Was it just a generic, will you do a survey, or did it mention?
Yeah, and actually, the way I think Amazon's Mechanical Turk works is that there's a pool of people who volunteer to take surveys.
Okay.
And then you list your survey with your payment amount that you're willing to pay, and that can vary because, like, our surveys were pretty short, so if you have a really long survey, you need to be willing to pay more. And then they can decide to take it or not. And, there is some discussion about, as I said, so the sample that we had a small pool of people who identified as very conservative. There's been discussion in the literature about how well does this really represent the U.S. and I think our sample was definitely a little bit more liberal leaning than the general U.S. population, but there's also been some literature to say that this type of mechanism actually works just as well as some other sort of in-person sampling and other mechanisms. So there are some problems, but.
Can you explain like the uptick in the blue at the end? Because I feel like the downward makes sense to me, but I'm not understanding the moderate, very conservative.
Yeah. So I mean, my one explanation is that there is a difference in when you're in sort of thinking about health implications, which was sort of the original hypothesis that maybe certain people respond more to a health framing, and that could be it. I mean, of course, there could be many reasons.
Really conservative people are pro-life.
Oh.
Yeah, and I think if you think, I mean, we could speculate about, lots of reasons, but just getting back to some of the thoughts we had when going into this is, health impacts can seem more personal. Maybe, you have family members that you have asthma or something, and so, it's hard to know exactly, but for our purposes, just we can say that, at least in this sample, these people responded more positively to the health frame.
Isn't the problem that those are the very people who won't do anything, whether it's a health problem or a climate problem?
Well, we do ask about actions, and again, it's just a survey, so we don't know if they would actually follow through on actions. But let me show some of those results.
Wasn't that your first slide? To say the very conservative people said neither would motivate them to do it.
Right. Oh, right. That neither was. Well, this would I'm sure. Right. Some of them. This is the mean response, and so for some of those people, they're still not going to agree with this statement, or still wouldn't take any action. But overall, we see a little bit more of a higher mean response in this group in the health frame.
Sorry, was this an action? Sorry, was this an action question?
This particular question is just, do you agree with this statement?
Right.
Now I'm going to show some action questions, which are right here. So we'll talk about these. But in general, they fell into categories about beliefs, personal willingness to do some things, and some concrete steps. So in terms of the beliefs questions, we asked, do you agree that there should be a reduction in air pollution? And also, are you in favor of national policies and regulations that decrease air pollution? And for both of these, although it's hard to tell here, but when testing it statistically, we saw this same pattern of this sort of crossover effect. Definitely, you can see that a little bit more clearly here, and it's very highly statistically significant in terms of the differences in terms of the difference that political orientation had on the effect of the frame. But you can see, so it's here too, but a little more difficult to discern with the naked eye. These statistics are based on controlling for other sample characteristics of the population. But again, we see that in terms of being in favor of policies that might decrease air pollution, when primed with that initial frame that was discussed in terms of health, we see that people on this end of the spectrum are a little bit more likely to agree or to be in favor of those regulations than if they had seen that statement primed from a climate change perspective. We also asked questions about personal willingness. So do you feel a personal responsibility to take action to decrease air pollution? And would you be willing to donate to a charity that focuses on reducing air pollution? And so then we sort of thought, oh, we're on a roll. We're going to see this crossover effect again. And, that's just how data goes. We didn't see it. And so we were like, that's interesting. Okay, so we were, seeing, at least this is an easier one to look at, but, this decline in sort of what you would be willing to do, and the climate frame always seems to come out higher. So now we're a little puzzled. Our theory doesn't work as well. But what we thought about a little bit more was, okay, well, let's try to think about all of these results. And there were some others, but I'm not going to show all the details. But and thinking about the patterns that we saw. So we saw that there was this crossover pattern for things like, do you feel like air pollution should be reduced? Do you think regulations should, are you in favor of regulations? And then there was this sort of more, what we'll call a main effect, or just this parallel pattern when things were related to things like personal responsibility. So we thought that was kind of interesting, and maybe that actually has something to do with the type of solution that was imposed. Things like regulations are an externally imposed solution, and things like charity are very much a personal action. And you can find, there is, again, literature in this that I think is very relevant to this panel when it comes to cultural cognition theory. There's a concept called identity affirmation, where individuals tend to react dismissively towards information that threatens their cultural values. And so in thinking about this, and again, just trying to think about what kinds of explanations or what kinds of things might explain some of the results we were seeing, we thought, well, okay, so maybe with externally imposed solutions, this threatens conservative cultural identity, and this may lead to the difference in processing. So then there's a strong reaction to that climate, or a strong negative reaction to that climate frame, but less so for that health frame. Again, it's hard to say definitively that that's the reason, but that could explain some of the results. Whereas the personal solutions maybe were less threatening to that identity, and we still saw less of a difference in processing of the frames. So in conclusion, we, not surprisingly, in this work found that political orientation was a critical driver in almost every question. It's certainly something that you could not take out of the equation when looking at these results. And time and again, we actually saw that examples of language, if you think back to the term fossil fuel, and examples of solutions in that last framing experiment seem to perhaps trigger a reaction based in cultural values and inform the way somebody responds to messaging or policy ideas or plans. And for us, something that we thought was interesting, again, because thinking about maybe populations that might be hard to reach with traditional climate change messaging strategies, we thought it was interesting that those who identified as more conservative were more likely to agree with externally imposed solutions when these things were primed in a public health frame, a present-day public health frame. And so just overall, these things I think are really important to keep in mind when you're thinking about these types of messaging and communication strategies. in terms of who your target audience is. So I want to acknowledge my collaborators on this, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but this work was all completed while I was a fellow at Columbia University, so some funding there, and this is a citation to the publication that describes these studies in more detail. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. That was a great presentation. This kind of work is really important stuff. And what I am going to try to do is build on it a little bit and give you a little bit of an idea of where I think I might be adding something, or where there might even be some disagreement, although I'm not sure there's a lot of disagreement in the sorts of things that we're going to be saying today. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to try to make the case by mixing in some cognitive science, some law, and climate change. I'm going to make the case that, that generally speaking, policymakers don't understand enough about how people actually think about climate science, or think about a lot of things for that matter. And the second part is that's a problem, all right, that law actually, I think, could change, because what law does, the same way a lot of institutions do this, is they express things and they allow people to understand things in frames. And the last thing I want to argue is that I think the whole mechanism of preparing for climate change, that is adapting to climate change, is a unique cognitive gateway into getting people to accept climate science. Now, Jamie's talked about another, what I would call a cognitive gateway, which is to say, let's talk about it in terms of public health. And actually, that's another one that people talk a lot about, and I think that that is a cognitive gateway into this discussion, too. I got interested in this, and incidentally, this is part of an article that actually should be coming out any month now, although law students go slowly. I go slowly, so they can go slowly. But I started working on this piece actually from some ideas I had when I was at EPA, because one of the things I was doing at EPA was trying to design for EPA a climate adaptation program for the federal agency. And then I was later working on President Obama's Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, in which we were trying to develop a scheme for adaptation for all of the federal government. And we talked to communication specialists all the time to figure out who do people trust, what do they want to hear, how do you frame it, these sorts of things. And then the other thing that got me going was that a friend of mine named Dan Kahan, who was cited in one of your slides, has been writing an awful lot about the social science part of this, and specifically about the psychology part. And we went to law school together, so I called him and I said, send me all your stuff. And so we've been working a little bit on various things. And so some of these ideas are ideas that I'll be talking about there. I'm just going to say what everybody might already know, which is that the public concern about global warming is relatively low. But here's the thing. From 1989 until 2013, it's gone down. All right? And in terms of talking to people about what the primary cause of global warming is, whether it's human activity or something else, that has gone down too, all right? Even though the evidence, the scientific evidence, has only gotten stronger, all right? So one of the questions, this is all about the United States, incidentally, and there are lots of surveys, and some have different conclusions than others, but these trends exist. So why would that be? Right? So one idea that lots of people in the sciences and in federal government subscribe to is this idea that's colloquially called the empty bucket theory. And the idea is if you just opened up people's heads and shoveled in enough information, they would believe you. Right? They would believe in the climate science. And I talk to people at the NAS, and I talk to people at EPA and at NASA, and they're all about, oh, we need to fund more school programs so that kids learn about the scientific method and about hypotheses and about what a fact is, and if we just had better shows on television. And so you can test this, right? So there's one idea. Another idea is this expert panel theory, right, which is if just enough people knew that 97 climate scientists out of 100 subscribe to X or use the same toothpaste or whatever it is, we'd all believe it, right? Now, there's a way to test this, and my friend Dan Kahan has done that in a whole project that he calls cultural cognition. And just to cut to the chase, he decided with a group of behavioral scientists and so on, they were going to do some surveys as well. And they were interested in knowing whether people, this just means who have low numeracy and scientific background, would do worse in understanding about the risk of climate change than people who know a lot. Because the people who understand the scientific method and hypotheses and who know all the numbers, they should care more, right? And so in statistics, you draw a line like that and say, that's my hypothesis, right? This is what's going to happen. I'm going to interview people. I'm going to give them science and math tests so I know who's good at these sorts of things and comfortable with it. And then what I will see is that the people who are, just don't understand science very well are not going to do well, and it's going like this, right? So here's what they found. Right? And then they said, well, wait a minute, maybe we had the chart upside down or, whatever. And so they started to dig a little deeper. But what they had done ahead of time, because they're very clever people at Yale, what they did is they gave these folks a different test as well that I haven't told you about. And the test they gave them was a personality test. And the personality test was an older test, so there's data on it, and it was designed to see whether people, by answering a series of questions, would come out as more egalitarian or hierarchical, whether they would come out as more communitarian, or whether they would come out as more libertarian, right? So if you think of these as two different axes. And incidentally, here's the kicker. You might be a Democrat and not be egalitarian and communitarian. And you might be a Republican and not be a hierarch or a libertarian. They do trend in those directions, but they are not themselves the definitions. And in fact, what a lot of their studies show is that this personality test gets you better results than conservative liberal does. All right? And there's controversy over this. People use all kinds of different things. They're trying to figure it out, okay? But here's what they found. Look at this. People who are egalitarian / communitarian, their knowledge, as their knowledge increases, they believe a little bit more in the risk of climate change. But you know what? The people who don't understand anything are way up there to begin with, right? And actually, look at this. The more you know on this other line, the less you believe. Because folks are able to talk their way, we're in a law school, right? You're able to talk your way out of the conclusions that make you feel uncomfortable. Now, here I want to drop a footnote because what these folks would want you to know is that they specialize in testing polarizing issues, okay, which has a particular kind of definition. Most things in the world are not polarizing issues. We do have more than we used to for reasons that you can discuss in the halls, right? But what that means, right, what that means is if you go into the doctor and say, I have a lousy allergy, I need something for it, and the doctor says, okay, well, take this allergy medicine, you will take it. You will take it whether you're an egalitarian, you'll take it whether you're a hierarch, you'll take it whatever, right? Because, with a small exception of the people that Eric knows who live in Hut. But most people are going to take the medicine because most people actually believe in science when believing in science doesn't change a basic foundation of your worldview, right? But when believing in science does change or force you to accommodate something that is against your worldview, like world cooperation to solve a problem, or like massive federal regulation, I mean, those things, I smile when I think about those things, but a lot of people don't. And when they don't, right, it makes them, oh, I don't know if I can go there. So here are just a few different things that they are trying to develop. Now, this is going a little further than Jamie does, and this is more controversial stuff. What they are trying to do is explain why this happens. And what they are imagining is that worldviews are something you start with at a very young age, and they're something you might not even acknowledge if we're thinking of a worldview as communitarian, egalitarian, and so on. Those worldviews create emotions immediately in your brain. All right, when you hear the word fossil fuel, there is an emotional spark somewhere. And that emotion helps you, through logic and reason, decide what you think about it. All right? So what is not happening here is that your brain is using logic first and then making you feel angry or happy and then having you reach a decision. It's exactly the opposite. Your brain is sensing the emotion first, and then you're saying, okay, what do I think about it now, using my logic. Now, you might think this is crazy or stuff they think up at Yale, but, Aristotle thought this way, right? He talked about passions moving logic. And actually David Hume, right, another sort of old Scottish philosopher, right, believed that that passions, that emotions moved how people think, and that it was a mistake to think that logic was not the slave of passion, to use his words. He believed that passion, or that logic was the slave of passion. All right? So if this is true, then we have to figure out how to get at the emotional part. Now, and this just shows that where those emotions might come from. Dan Kahan and his friends are really good at figuring out how to piss people off. So what they do is, instead of talking about climate change, they said, let's talk about guns, right? And so what they did is they gave this chart, and it's a little busy. Let me just explain what it means, all right? What it means is that for people who are very well educated in the sciences and math, they are more likely to misread an objective chart when the conclusion butts against their previous beliefs. And so what they did is they gave a chart. It was kind of difficult to understand. It's the kind of chart they use in IQ tests, and they said, this chart's about lotion, hand lotion. Tell me whether the hand lotion works or not. And so people read the chart, and actually a lot of people did really well. If the chart purported to say lotion worked, they said it worked, it didn't. And guess what? The more people understood about math and science, the better they were at reading those charts. That's what you'd expect. Then they gave the same charts, except they took away hand lotion and they put handguns instead. And then they said, look at this chart. Does handgun regulation make a community safer? Now, some of the charts said it did, and some of the charts said it didn't. They mixed them all up. They gave them out to people. And what they found out is the liberals who were well-educated refused to read correctly a chart that said that handgun regulation makes a community safe, or that handgun regulation makes a community more dangerous, right? And opposite for the other side. And so Chris Mooney, who is a journalist who writes a lot about science, had a great article on this that he said, politics wrecks the ability of your brain to do math. Right? And this explains a lot. I know you know that. So, the other one that he did, and they picked the HPV vaccine because that's a vaccine for STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. It's very, culturally, it's very controversial. And what they found out is they gave these different experts, so-called, with the exact same resume. They had, PhDs from an Ivy League school, and they'd done exactly the same thing. And they said, here, these folks are going to tell you about whether the HPV vaccine a good deal or not. What do you think about this person? And what they found out is if you're a hierarchist who is an individualist, this is your guy, right? This is the guy you're going to believe and think that he is the best. If you are an egalitarian, communitarian, you're going to dig the beard and the denim shirt. That's the guy for you. Now, what's interesting about this, right, is this has to do again with emotions, actually with trust. who do you trust? You trust the doctor. You don't say to the doctor, give me all the studies. What about how do sunspots affect the study on the allergy medicine? You don't do that, right? Because you just say the doctor knows, right? And I'm going to trust the doctor. You know, you go to your accountant with an economic problem. You don't say, I have to invent calculus before I believe you. You don't, you don't do that. What you do is you just say, this person I believe. So what do we do about that? Well, it seems that one way to work on a problem like this is to start, just as Jamie's encouraging us, to start with frames that resonate with cultural views. And then the other thing is to find a neighbor, or what psychologists call a voucher, somebody trustworthy in the community to say the thing that you think needs to be said. Right? Now, we've been relying, I think we can agree, for way too long on Neil deGrasse Tyson to tell us everything about climate, right? That appeals to some people, right? But there are some people who are just never going to listen to him, or Bill Nye, or me, and certainly Al Gore, right? So what we need in an environment like this are what I sometimes call super vouchers. We need people who have sort of global recognition and who hit trust on many different levels. The Pope might be a super voucher. Until recently. Well, the first sad thing that happens when the Pope comes out with this is everyone who's against the message starts to undercut and deflate his trustworthiness. Oh, people are lying to him, or he doesn't understand science, or whatever it is. So what could we do if we were interested in law in this area? Well, what we might do, it seems to me, is look for ways that the executive and legislative branches can talk in terms of these kinds of frames. And in the article, I kind of have a little fun with President Obama, who when one of, not the Clean Power Plan, but one of his earlier plans, I got the whole text of his statement about it. And it's all about reducing carbon from stationary sources, and it never once mentions the term climate change or greenhouse gases. Right? All it talks about, incidentally, he talks a lot about public health, but he never tells you why it's healthy. He just says it's good for public health. And then he talks about efficiency, but he never mentions fossil fuel. Right? And he goes on and on and on. And so in a way, he's trying to do this, it seems to me, or somebody who's writing a speech is trying to do that. It also seems to me judges could learn to talk in different ways. Now, here's the thing I've been saying, that when I deliver this speech to legal communities, I get some pushback on. So maybe I'll get it with you too, I don't know. I think one of the problems with the prescription of frames and neighbors is that if we are talking about scale and making things concrete or tangible and accessible, because that's where emotions lie, there's a whole set of data about that too. I think it's really hard to broadcast a message. That is, to make a message that can be globally consumable or even nationally consumable. That is because these people with all the different cultural values, we are all in different smaller communities. And the people we trust are all different. You cannot cart out Al Gore and put him in front of the nation, right? And you can't do that with Bill Nye or anybody, or Lord knows Donald Trump, right? What you need to do is you need to narrowcast. You need to find your local communities or your local groups and speak to them in a particular set of frames. And that, I think, is very difficult to do if what you're after is reducing greenhouse gases. I think that's the most important thing we could probably be doing on the planet, is reducing greenhouse gases. But it's a global and a federal mission to do those sorts of things, just because of the size. And that's why I think, although I think we should do it, I think it's much harder to crack that nut. The nut that is easier, I think, and I'm just going to skip a little bit here. There's reducing greenhouse gases is mitigation. Adapting to climate change is preparing. And I'm just going to move through some of this because we can talk about this later. I'll get to the controversial. It's not controversial, I don't think. But the idea is that adaptation preparing for climate change is local inherently. I found that out working in the federal government, trying to come up with a program for it, because most of what we were doing was trying to find a program that would help local communities. And in fact, one of the things I did a few years back, and wrote about this too, is I led a team that went to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and we were trying to work with them to give them climate science information in order for them to redesign some of their cities that have been flooded by 3 different 100-year floods in a 30-year period. You didn't talk about climate change, incidentally. This is the last story I'll just end on to sort of make the point. I had a group, we're all in Washington, D.C. We're going to fly out to Iowa. We had some friends who were working in Iowa in these groups. And what we were trying to do was, Cedar Rapids was putting together a hazard mitigation plan, a required and very local exercise. And what we wanted to do, we got FEMA involved, and we said, FEMA, can you give them some extra credits of some kind if they will put climate projections in their hazard mitigation plan? Now think about that. That's a federal government. If you can get thousands and tens of thousands of communities around the country to shoehorn climate science into all of their hazard mitigation plans, you've done something, right? So we said, well, we're going to go in there and try to help them do that. And so a great person working for me says, I know the best scientist at MIT. We'll bring him down and he'll tell them, people in Cedar Rapids, about climate change. And I'm like, nobody from MIT is setting foot on the plane. So we found climate scientists at Iowa State who knew all the rivers and streams and have fished them since they were little. And they came out and they didn't say a word about climate. They talked about stream flows getting bigger and bigger every year, like by 30, 40%. And everyone, yeah, that's happening. You know why? Oh, I don't know why, but it's happening. And so this worked. Now, you can't buffalo people, right? And so after a day, we did that. I went back. My group kept going back and forth for months. And finally, we moved into the climate kinds of questions. And by then, we were able to get the science data in. Does that mean Dan Kahan is wrong and all the people at Yale are wrong about being able to change people's minds because of their cultural value? No, because his studies are basically about showing people 750-word op-eds about something and say, do you agree with that? And then there are people who say, I agree with it or I don't agree with it, and that's the end. Right? You cannot change anybody's mind on this level with the 750-word op-ed. What you can do, and there is data showing this, is you can take people along, involve them in small groups, give them information, ask them to do something themselves with that information, and have them go back and forth for a period of time. It's what teachers do. If you have a semester with somebody, you can do that, but you cannot fill their head up with a shovel. That doesn't work. And so those are some of the things that I'm kind of looking at. So my idea is, it seems to me, for a variety of reasons, adaptation might be a good way to do that. We need to adapt not just to manage, but actually to address climate change at all. It seems to me, through this cognitive gateway. And so I'll just stop there, and we can have some questions and discussion.
We can stand together, don't you think, for a minute?
Well, we can
so
bring chairs.
Or you can sit, or you can sit. I'm glad to see, Rob, you sort of wound back, ending where I tried to start you, and some of this.
Where you tried to start?
I tried to start. No, I tried to start the session. This cultural and political identity issue. There is also being work done with sort of what we listen to, and so we really, in essence, what I get from it. You can disagree. Is that. Yeah, this is what lawyers learn all the time. Be a good advocate. Know your jury. Know your judge. In Indiana, it's not health. Well, sometimes it's health, but it's money, money, money. It's the Benjamins, right? I'm always in natural resources when we're talking about endangered species. I start by showing a picture of a species and saying, who cares? It's it's alive or dead. Then we talk about the economic impact. We talk about what's in it for us, the human impact. And so it's messaging, if you will, it's framing. And so this is really critical stuff. And the point I was trying to make at the beginning is some of the same research is being applied to the willingness of our fellow citizens to accept that framing and messaging. And so the Iowa example is a great example of how when you get to, on a local level, especially post-disaster, I've done some work on democracy and disaster, and gosh, you know a little about that here in New Orleans too, don't you? Post-disaster, post-traumatic event, folks are more open to, okay, what do we do about this? I mean, it's more palpable. It's not the distant, oh, I'm smoking cancer maybe 30 years from now. And I know that's a personal choice versus something imposed. But so in that example, they still didn't come in with big ideas about saving the world. They still didn't show people in Bangladesh. They showed locals, and here's how we prevent this or help ourselves next time, the adaptation piece. I don't know what that says, Rob. Offline we'll talk about this, about how we sell the mitigation piece, how we advocate that there really...
Jamie's got a good idea.
Well, I think she does. It's framing, yeah. I mean, in part. So anyway, I just think this is one of the toughest issues facing our time. And there are lessons for lawyers and law students in it, but there are also challenges. So I'm going to just open the floor and ask you guys to throw your questions in there. Go ahead.
Question, I had a quick look at some art. I guess I figure artists are pretty good at triggering emotional response, so they might be a good place to look. And I sort of did an art project, I think it was in South Carolina, where somebody started to paint blue lines on buildings for how high the tides would go at some future date, and it generated a lot of controversy. And I wonder whether anybody had either done any work on those kind of things, see whether they actually do change minds, or what your thoughts were.
They've done that in New York City too, actually.
Yeah, but I mean,
yeah. Well, you know what is good about that, actually. What I learned from some of our communications people when I was at EPA was that having good artists and architects who are able to say, here's a green development with bioswales and rooftop gardens, things that are designed to keep water away and to keep us safe. And people look at it and they say, oh, but it's actually really pretty. You know, actually, I think if I ran a restaurant there, I'd make more money. And it's that ability to be able to make that emotional connection.
Let me come back to this side. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Bad because I forgot both people's names.
Speak a little louder. It's okay.
I was wondering on the first data sets, did you have geo information from people?
Jamie.
Like where they were located?
Yeah, we do actually. We have zip code, and it's interesting because because of other things, took a little while to get around to this. But I've just started to look at. We looked at like things like if they lived in an urban or rural location. But what I've just recently done is try to match the geolocation to two metrics of using EPA data on air quality in that particular area, and a simple measure of just looking at, if they've historically, if that neighborhood has exceeded air quality standards. And then I also pulled some data from the National Climate Data Center about historical extreme weather events to see if that sort of correlated with people's response about climate change. And it's all very preliminary, and so I really need to do some better data analysis of it. But there did seem to be some signal. It seems like there might be some preliminary signal with experience of some extreme weather event, and I included everything from hurricanes to extreme heat events and things like that. So.
Okay. Yes.
Rob, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about kind of the criticism of the educate the classrooms kind of style. Have you done any thinking with the nature deficit disorder hypothesis, and that you need to have those connections to the natural environment to care? I mean, that's a little bit different than sitting down in a classroom and watching some video the EPA sends to school, but.
This is Richard Loob's work on what's called nature deficit disorder, this idea that being outside in an unstructured way with nature is sort of central to human well-being. and that it creates that connection. And you know, I'll just say something very short, but I thought it was interesting. I happened to be in a conversation with him a few years back, and we were talking about caring about nature. And he said, you know, when I raised my own son, he says, I'm afraid I might have done something wrong. I said, what do you mean? He says, because I would often point to forests or whatever, and I'd say, son, look at it. That's the last time you're going to see it in a pristine sense. Or we're fishing now. Son, enjoy it, but we're not going to have that again. And he said, you know, I kind of think that maybe my son stopped caring about it, the same way that some kids who've been abandoned will, you know, if they're from foster care or whatever, they'll stop getting their hopes up and falling in love with parent because it's too painful to anticipate the separation. And that was his view, and it struck with me for many, many years, this idea that there does have to be an emotional connection, and your kids have to be able to love even scarred landscapes, because if they don't love them, they won't protect them.
And again, the advocacy piece is trying to create the emotional connection, if you can, when you're not when you're framing a scientific question, but when you're being a lawyer and being an advocate for the plan.
And a parent.
And a parent. Okay, let's start with the basic piece. Sir.
I mean, don't the climate deniers, they know their stuff too, and I mean, aren't like the Koch brothers and Exxon even better at this? I remember seeing an issue of Vice where the Fossil Fuel Association was using the same marketing firm as Big Tobacco to cast doubt on all, you know, that climate change is actually true.
They're certainly putting money into it, aren't they?
I'll just say, there's a really great study, it's a few years old, done by Yale, a communications department, and some other folks. It's called Six Americas. If you Google Yale and Six Americas, you'll get it. And it's a really interesting study. They say there are 6 kinds of Americans in terms of their views on climate change. And most of them in the middle are persuadable. And that's the light at the end of the tunnel. There are people on either side you're not going to persuade about anything. But most people are persuadable.
Good old political theory there. Yes.
When we're talking about framing, a lot of times we see that the messages are framed either in a positive light or a negative light, like fear versus isn't this something we hope to do instead. What in your work have you seen is actually more valuable, and is that also politically charged?
Yeah, I mean, so I should mention that there were aspects of the study that I didn't talk about, and we also, based on literature that has talked about that and the positive and negative, we did try, you know, in an earlier version, different versions of the health and climate frame, you know, sort of, you know, talking about dire consequences and talking about the benefits. We didn't actually see much of an effect in that preliminary work, in that particular study, but I know that, you know, it has been done in other work, and there has been evidence of differences.
Yes.
So one of your slides, you showed the should we do stuff, but do we want to pay for it dichotomy. It was a general trend from about 5 to 4. It says, should we do things, should we have implementations to address air pollution? Yes, went from about 5 to 4. But the other one was, should we pay for it? And it was from 4 to 3. And how do you, that's just basic bigotry. How do you fix that?
I think you're...
So, hold on. The next panel called fixing bigotry.
So maybe,
you know which, you want to pull that slide up again real quick?
Helpful. I'm not
let's look at the slide so we all
I think
see
because
reference point.
the scale was different because we didn't have responses on that. Is that
yeah,
what
yeah.
you're talking about? Let's see. Oh, whoops. Wait.
Right, because national policies implies that there's a tax.
Right. Yeah.
Or control.
Or control.
Or
And
something.
this is just blatant.
Yeah, so that's a great point. I think that I didn't highlight. I was sort of emphasizing the crossover, but yeah, in sort of the absolute response, we do see on average, a much lower response rate here when you talk about actual policy implementation than just sort of agreeing. And yeah,
But one way to think about this, Rob, weigh in, is that on the quote-unquote conservative side, the questions could also be framed as, hey, should we do something? Sure. But we see the personal responsibility, et cetera, versus should we regulate something, which I think is something that a conservative, quote-unquote, a libertarian is going to avoid. So let's all go do something is different, or we should ought to do something is different from let's regulate. And my guess is if you were to frame even the word regulations is going to be a term that is going to have a visceral response.
yeah, I think you're
As
right.
fossil
Just
fuel.
like fossil fuel.
Right, and maybe even the term air pollution in one of your earlier slides is something, because these words have been used in this debate and they do bring reactions from folks on that side of the political spectrum. Just a thought. Question?
Yeah, got so many, and I try to not ask them all. Although it's very interesting that both Germany and Rwanda are among the most educated countries in their continent right before genocide, which I think reinforces the point about knowledge and facts not having anything to do with actions. So on this idea of the frame on public health, which is just so fascinating, you can speak to conservatives, and this idea that liberals are leading the argument, so they keep pushing climate, and conservatives are not pushing health. I am curious to know if Obama was successful, or if he could have been, in the example you cited, Rob, to speak to Jamie's frame. But I want to go a little further than that for just a second and throw out an idea around this idea of the super voucher. I think you're asking the right question, but I think we could reverse the question. I ran a campaign once called Superman is an Immigrant. And
Say it again?
Superman is an immigrant.
Oh, I see.
Because he is.
Sure.
And it got a lot of media attention, and a bunch of right-wingers on TV went after it without any counterpart. And after it was over, I was like, wow, we just won that debate. Because they just kept saying that name in the freaking campaign. So we had won the frame before they had... And the mythology piece is what I feel is missing here. And in asking for who is the super voucher, is it the quote, who do we trust? I think the question should be, who should we unify around not trusting? And to go to this question about these different types in cultural cognition, I'd be really curious if there's a way to get the data on, because we're talking about a World War III scenario of climate change on some level. What did it take from 1935 to 1942? What were the different types that did not want to enter World War II? And what were the precipitating factors that got those types engaged in, yes, we need to go to World War II.
Security.
Right. So, but just getting into this idea of hierarchy.
For Harvard Health.
Yeah, well, that's my point. It's pretty obvious. It's like,
War makes money.
But the piece I wanted to go to is, back to the Superman piece, is to work with someone like Joss Whedon to create a super villain that is animated, who is climate change, and is giving a big F you to everybody. And we can use multiple frames. We talked about it's going to make your kids sick. So it's the public health frame. It's going to talk about the climate. He's going to talk about how it's not a matter of if I win, but when I win. Instead of a little dog that he's petting the decapitated head of a polar bear.
So hold on. Let me make sure. I want to give these guys a chance to answer briefly because we're almost out of time. But it's almost the Otto von Bismarck idea. We need a common enemy. So it's super villain versus super voucher. What do you say?
Well, you know what? There's if you can Google this. There are some folks using a little bit of art, and what they're doing is they're using what do you call it? Thermal imaging, so that you can see in a satellite photo the CO2 floating around the world, and you can actually see it coming out of smokestacks the way that you can see diesel air pollution coming out of a smokestack, and it's that visual ick factor that I haven't seen anyone test it, that might actually sort of bring this supervillain idea
There you go.
in a visual way.
There you go. Thank you. And thank you all. As Rob said, a lot of this has to continue in the hall. but keep it down to 8 minutes because the next panels start, and so we're going to mix it up. Thank you to all of you for showing up, and thank you again to our speakers.